So anyway, thank you for being here. So I guess my role really in my company is to kind of look at the future and help understand, help our customers and the world at large understand the way we see the world, what we see going on, and convey how it impacts the products and services that we build. People tend to think of VMware as this virtualization company, and we're in a very particular space. But I joined VMware about 2 years ago from eBay for a very specific reason, because I felt that this technology was not the be-all and end-all, that it is actually a foundation for a far more exciting and interesting journey that I felt compelled to go on. And I've already been part of it, I guess. I've been lucky enough. This is my third-gen company, I guess, if you will. I was at eBay for 5 years. And in some sense, it was a kind of the perfect petri dish for understanding where you and more traditional enterprise organizations are heading. They use standard off-the-shelf physical components, standard off-the-shelf operating systems, but they had the new class of applications and services that are ultra-scalable, ultra-adaptable, that change very, very rapidly. But they had a lot of the same challenges that you do, and for me, that was an opportunity to learn. So without further ado, Frank intimated, that he first came across cloud, I guess, in about 2008. For me, it was a little bit sooner. I had the pleasure of seeing this in about 2006, 2007, and I joint keynoted at the first Next-Gen Data Center conference with Werner Vogels from Amazon, who was introducing Amazon Web Services. And when I first heard the term cloud, it was this oh no moment as opposed to an aha moment. I thought, oh, we've been here before. We've been talking about utility computing and on-demand. We've had agile enterprise. We had adaptive this and things like that. And in the sense of, so this cloud thing, is it just a rehash of all the same stuff that's gone before? And, for me, no. And I believe for VMware, no. And I believe for you, no. Because cloud isn't very specifically about technology. Cloud is something fundamentally different. It's really a new consumption model for the delivery and consumption of IT services. It's this fundamentally new model which is disruptive. The technologies have been evolving for a long time, but there's a level of maturity and pervasive adoption of certain technologies that has fundamentally enabled this new business model. The notion of self-service IT that is instantly provisioned, it's pay for use, it's cost efficient, and ultimately it scales up and it scales down. We have never had IT like this before. If we used to buy hardware and software, we would configure them, we'd put them together. It existed in our own data centers, or we put it into a colo, or whatever. Or if we outsourced it, we got someone else to do essentially the same thing for us. And we had a long-term upfront agreement with them, and away we would go. This new consumption model is fundamentally changing the landscape. It is not only providing choice as to how you deliver value to your businesses, but it has fundamentally changed the expectations that your business partners have of you. That the mere existence of cloud providers externally is fundamentally shifting things. So for this, personally, I find this incredibly exciting. It's the most exciting time in my career in IT. I've been around 30 years, and I was reminded of having been around so long in the IT space by actually spending some time at the Computer History Museum. And I was busy looking at all those devices and going, oh yes, I had one of those, and I had one of those, and I had one of those, and oh gosh, I had one of those. Is it really that old? It was kind of scary. But cloud is fundamentally different. Now, it does come back to some technology trends, and if we look at those technology trends, perhaps they tell us something not only about how we got to where we are, but the route forward. I'm a person who likes simplicity, so I'll only drill it down to 2. I'm a big fan of very simple pictures and simple ideas and narratives. The first thing that we really see is the evolution of software. That over 30 years, if I look back, we started with monolithic software that had very low business value. I think my first code was on a Z80, and I spent a day or two trying to make a block go across the screen and back. It felt very good, but it delivered no business value. But we've gone from that space of mainframe applications that were very hard to code and deliver through client-server, three-tier, multi-tier, and now the highly distributed and disaggregated applications and services that we see today. In truth, the vast majority of our customers still have an enormous legacy of client-server applications and services, and that is your challenge, is how you carry that legacy with you forward into the future, get the capabilities of this cloud thing, and allow yourselves to move forward. And legacy isn't one of those things you acquire over 15 or 20 years. I've worked with startups, and it takes you literally, the minute you've bought into something, you've got a legacy if you're not careful. You're going to have to carry it with you a long way, and that's a significant challenge. The other thing that's been evolving continuously over this period of time is the physical infrastructure itself. That really it has gone from extremely large monolithic machines connected with anemically thin pieces of wet string, if you will, into a fabric of resources that we see today in the data center. In fact, I would strongly argue that that fabric goes way beyond the data center. It goes all the way out into, let me see here, I have a different kind of smartphone. It's actually got a hypervisor on it, but I'll come back to that later, perhaps. But these devices have 2 and 4 cores on them. It's got a 720p screen that I can watch Star Wars in high definition, should I choose to do it and give myself some nostalgia moments. So in fact, if we look at the history of this technology, what's been going on for 30 years is a constant ebb and flow of functionality and value across the network, backwards and forwards, as certain technology evolution comes about and certain price points shift and change. We push stuff out to the desktop because whilst the MIPS may not have been cheaper, they were available MIPS, and they didn't have to have a multi-million-dollar purchase order in order to acquire those MIPS. And they gave people some independence and the ability to actually evolve and innovate themselves and add value. Then we discovered it wasn't very manageable, and we pulled the stuff inside. And then we created rich internet applications so we could put the apps out, but we didn't have to worry about managing the client that consumed those apps. And that leads us to the kind of world that we're in today. And for me, there are 2 very specific things that have come about in the last 5 to 10 years that are particularly exciting. So my passion for pretty much the majority of those years has been figuring out how do we manage very large infrastructure. In fact, how do we turn IT infrastructure into a platform on which to run the business? So we essentially hide the complexity of the infrastructure. We don't want to see all those bits and bytes and servers and storage. They're just things that run the services that we care about on them. And how do we get there? The difficulty with getting there has really been the enormous diversity and heterogeneity in our infrastructure. All of those different things, those different components and servers and storage and everything else that we buy, all change at a very high rate. And there's a very large number of them, which means that they're almost impossible to manage consistently. But what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years is the massive adoption of x86, i.e. commodity hardware, in the data center. This has actually created a large enough pool inside the data center in terms of, essentially equivalent and homogeneous environment with which we can actually go after in terms of solving the management problem and an automation problem. And the other fundamental thing is the pervasive adoption of virtualization. Once we have essentially separated the application from the underlying physical infrastructure, we start getting all of these wonderful choices that we never had. The capability to squish lots of those virtual machines, if you will, onto physical infrastructure and minimize the amount of physical hardware and get economy. The ability to move applications and services around, to deliver new ways of achieving availability, to allow new provisioning models and such like. So truly, in the last 5 years, things have fundamentally shifted. Now, sometimes I joke, people think of my company today as being very much an infrastructure company, but I would strongly argue that infrastructure means nothing without the applications and services that run on it. In truth, it's just, you'd like it just to be a detail, right? You pay the cost, it delivers the right SLA at the right price, and you don't want to really care about all that physical infrastructure. And it's really the applications and services that matter. So the interesting trend is as you pull apart apps and services, you're essentially pulling apart the business processes that they support. You're tugging them apart. As you pull them out of the silos, there's an interesting set of opportunities that become ripe for exploitation. The first is for the separate optimization, deployment, scaling, and management of those apps and services themselves. That's sort of interesting. But the truly interesting thing is as you pull those things apart, therein you suddenly have this opportunity to focus on the applications and services that truly differentiate your business and allow you to execute on your core mission. And you can seek to commoditize the IT that does not differentiate you. I think there's a very strong argument that very few organizations are truly differentiated by owning physical infrastructure. Very few organizations are truly differentiated with most of the packaged applications they run and things like HR and payroll and everything else, things we think of as software as a service. Indeed, at VMware, we have something like 25 software as a service applications that we use, ranging from healthcare, HR, payroll, all the way through to customer relationship management. And we choose to focus our efforts on what truly differentiates us, which is innovation in terms of software that enables this new cloud thing, if you will, and enables our customers to innovate in their businesses. But the thing that's become exciting about this, in terms of this disaggregation, is you can now source those non-differentiating things, infrastructure, platforms, and software as services, from this thing called the cloud, and you can get them with this incredibly convenient acquisition model, a notion of self-service, instantly provisioned, pay for what you use, scale up, scale down when you don't need it. This is fundamentally new, and we would strongly argue that this is fundamentally transformative for businesses, and it is transformative for you as CIOs. It gives you an opportunity to go back to the business and say, what truly does differentiate us? What are our goals as an organization in terms of what we want to achieve in the marketplace? What is the IT that facilitates and supports that differentiation? How should we invest in that IT? And then how do we seek to commoditize the IT that does not differentiate us, that does not give us competitive advantage, does not allow us to succeed in our mission or delivery of value quicker, whatever it is? That is the true opportunity of cloud. It is fundamentally disruptive, and it's disruptive because of the business model that is enabled by the technology, not by the technology per se. So perhaps one way of thinking about this, and if you can't tell, I'm kind of a person who likes stories and narratives. You can imagine being an entrepreneur, someone with an idea, an innovator. You could be sat on the beach somewhere, and in this world that we're heading towards surprisingly rapidly, if you have an idea, you're able to codify that idea for the platform that is the cloud. And believe you me, it is ever easier to stitch these things together than it ever used to be. As long as you can pay for it with a credit card, you can upload it, and you can monetize it. This is fundamentally different. As someone who used to advise a number of startups, what did they used to do? They'd have a smart idea, then they'd go down to the local electronics store, they'd buy a rack full of servers, they would put them in their garage or in their wardrobe, in their bedroom. They'd overheat very rapidly, and then they'd go and try to find a colo to put them in. But there was capital investment required. Today, for SMBs and startups, you can actually build a business with almost zero physical infrastructure. And there's a reasonable case to be made that in the longer term, 4G, we're already beginning to get there, but the next coming generations of cellular technology, that the vast majority of organizations, particularly SMBs and small businesses, they will not have any physical IT infrastructure. They'll just have devices that sit at the end of public infrastructure. This is fundamentally different, and they can innovate. So in the same way that if you think about the internet, in the same way that the internet gave organizations global access to markets to sell their goods and services, the cloud is providing organizations with global access to the IT resources from which to build their businesses. It is fundamentally reducing the barriers to entry to marketplaces for organizations. So when I was at a previous company, you would sit there and you'd look at it. If you're in the digital businesses, the services business, or whatever. You're sitting there, and as Frank said, you saw the knee of the runner behind that you didn't quite know who it was. In this world, your competitors, the ones you worry about are the ones you don't know about, because they can appear pretty damn quickly. And when I talk to customers in developing countries, they have this enormous opportunity. They have people with ideas, and instead of having to write purchase orders, waiting for export licenses to come through so that they can get hardware and everything else, they can just go and rent some hardware, rent some software, and off they go. This is fundamentally new. And so we think of this new kind of innovation is fundamentally shifting. There is less time to innovate. As Frank said, you try out these ideas. We talk a lot about things like fast failure, the fact that you can try ideas out, you can fail frequently. As someone who did research, I can argue that actually failure is good in some sense, because failure is the currency of knowledge. Very rarely do you truly learn something if you succeed the first time round, but the trick is you better succeed pretty damn quickly. You can't just keep trying and failing continuously. You want to succeed quickly, you want to succeed at a lower fundamental cost, and you want to do it with minimum risk. This is what we see happening in this world right now. Technology is enabling an ever higher rate of innovation and change. And so to give you a few examples of this, again, apologies if you can't read it clearly, it hasn't come out too badly on here, and again, emphasizing the rate of change comment that was made before. That really, if we look at this, we look at technologies like the telephone, how long it took to reach 10 million households. 38 years it took for the telephone to reach there. If we look at the cellular phone, 9 years. The VCR, 9 years. The internet took just 4 years to reach 10 million households, and Facebook took 2. This pervasive connectedness is leading to ever more rapid innovation and change. When I talk about my children, the thing that I find most amusing is I always thought of my parents as fuddy-duddies, right? And they're sitting there, and they're essentially Victorian, you kind of think of. They don't understand any of the technology I was using. I was playing around with stuff, and my dad said, what's this computer thingy, what's it? And everything else. And I thought I was on the bleeding edge, and heck, I live in Silicon Valley, I should be. But my children are doing things and picking things up so incredibly quickly that I feel that I can't keep up with this pace of change. But if you don't keep up and you don't keep your eyes out for this disruption, then you're ripe for finding your business model basically yanked from under you. If you look here for the example, the encyclopedia, look at what's happened in the last 22 years. Everyone used to buy an Encyclopedia Britannica or some big set, right, with which to acquire their knowledge. And it was big, and it was a kind of heirloom. You buy it, and you can pass it on to your children. Although I guess my children may not even have bookshelves in their homes by the time they go out and have their places. So this is already pretty dated. Then you had in Carter, and it was like, this is going to drive the encyclopedia out of business. And then everyone just gets their stuff off Wiki. Wikipedia. It's just gone. The entire, the knowledge is crowdsourced. It keeps up to date. If you see a celebrity die, their obituary will be on Wikipedia within 30 seconds. There's no way you can compete with that. It's a different way of doing things. This is all fundamentally disrupted, this rate of change. You look at movie rental. Blockbuster, they were doing fantastically, shifting VHS cassettes and then DVDs. Then Netflix came along, completely yanked their business model by posting things. And you could keep them as long as you like. You just don't get your next one until you return what you've already got. And then iTunes comes along, and you just rent the stuff and stream it. Blockbuster as a franchise is essentially dead in the US. They have ceased to exist, more or less. Their economic model has gone into history. Paleontologists will be looking at their business model in the future, not MBAs, right? And Netflix, if you follow them, so my best friend, Adrian Cockcroft, is their cloud architect. They are having to, they've introduced a lot of disruption into the marketplace because they've chosen to go the streaming route, alienated the vast majority of their existing DVD renters, but they essentially don't have a choice because that model of the physical asset being moved backwards and forwards in the logistics is becoming untenable. So the lesson here really, this rate of change is just going to keep going and keep going, and it is global. There are regional differences, there are legislative and government things, but the essential trends are pervasive. The great thing about New Zealand here is you are actually one of our most advanced countries if we look at the adoption of many of the technologies that make this real. So you're actually in a pretty good place. So if cloud is all about organizations being able to focus on their core differentiating value, then the question is, what can we learn from the providers of IT that is essentially a commodity that you consume and use? Maybe there's some things that we can learn. This is a breakdown of cost of it. Actually, it shouldn't be data center economics. A customer correctly pointed out this should be IT economics and service delivery economics. This is Gartner and McKinsey. This is numbers from 2009. I would suggest, I may be wrong, but my gut feel is actually the breakdown hasn't changed much in 20 years. That the vast majority of the cost is labor and software, and physical infrastructure is actually a very small part of it. There's some interesting things we can glean from this. We'd make a very strong assertion that this is not driven by complexity in physical infrastructure at all. It's actually driven by the size of the application portfolio that you consume and that you have. Every application and service that you have in your business, whether it's a spreadsheet formula, and some banks make billions of dollars on Excel spreadsheet formulas, or whether it's a Monte Carlo simulation that's hosted across 20, 30,000 CPUs, each one of those applications has to be either bought, created, architected, integrated, tested, installed, monitored, managed, has to be backed up, has to have a disaster recovery plan. That is what drives cost, an enormous amount of cost. And it's the diversity of the applications and services that you consume that does that. It's also an interesting observation that you say if you do outsourcing and an outsourcing partner gets your application portfolio, it truly explains why outsourcing really isn't about saving money per se. It's about risk mitigation. You're getting yourself a contract for fixed cost over a period of time and in minimizing your likelihood of variability of that cost. The true price you pay typically is a lack of flexibility because change is risk, and it's now become risk to your outsourcing provider. So the cloud model is subtly different, but it's not even subtly different, it's just incredibly different. So I don't have the credibility of a Gartner or a McKinsey, but as you can probably surmise, in some sense, Silicon Valley isn't that different from New Zealand. It's a relatively small community and everyone knows everyone. It's rather incestuous. So I have buddies at pretty much all of the cloud providers and the Web 2.0 providers. And so what we see here is a different kind of economics. It's the economics of specialization. They actually flip the cost model, where 80 to 85% of the cost turns into physical infrastructure costs. Because what you have is a tiny number of application patterns and deployment patterns. So literally, at my previous employer and at many of these other places like Amazon and Facebook, you're deploying literally a handful of different apps. And when you're deploying a handful of different patterns, you can massively automate the life cycle of every single one of those, so that you can deploy new value to site every hour of every day. You can bring new value to market really, really quickly. The true message to take away from this is that change and provisioning are not the way that you get to a steady state. They are part of the steady state. You are constantly provisioning and reprovisioning to deliver new customer value as quickly as possible, to balance load, to maximize the utilization of physical assets, whatever. That is what it is all about. And it's because of this cost model, once you get these economies of specialization, you get true economies of scale, and your biggest expense is your OpEx, which is energy. And that is why you see the big cloud providers obsessing on hyper-efficient power supplies in each of their machines. You'll see them figuring out how to put their machines in interesting places with low energy costs. They will run their data centers 5 to 10 degrees hotter than your average data center, because believe me, the hardware will run hotter. It's just a case of how much you want to be indemnified. But when you think about every degree that you have to chill can cost a fortune when you're running hundreds of thousands of machines. An interesting assertion, and I don't have the data to really back it up, is intuitively, in the long run, I think you can make a reasonable assertion that with these specializations, not only will you get more flexible and cheaper product, you should actually have higher quality, more robust, and more secure services in the long run, because these organizations are not peanut butter spreading all of their expertise across 4,000 or 5,000 applications. And literally, if I talk to a banking a CIO on Wall Street, they'll say they have between 3,000 and 5,000 applications. In fact, Boeing, who I talked to not that long ago, they said they had 6,000 apps. That's a hell of a lot of variety to manage inside their organization. That's really, really difficult. So we see that the economics of cloud are fundamentally different. And then the question is, for end users and CIOs, what does this mean in terms of, how do you take advantage of these new economics? Well, the first way clearly is you can acquire and use public cloud services. The second one, it's the opportunity for our company specifically and for virtualization in general, is that when you put applications inside this thing called a VM, from a day-to-day manageability perspective, those applications look alike enough for them to be the same from a day-to-day manageability perspective. Once they're inside this virtual machine, we can sit there and switch them on and off very easily. They all look the same. Yes, there are absolutely the devil's in the detail. When you want to do root cause analysis, you need to understand the semantics and all of that good stuff. But from the perspective of day-to-day manageability, you have an enormous opportunity to make it look homogeneous enough to start solving the management problem and to start doing this massive automation, which has flipped the cost model for the cloud providers. So we talked a bit about there's these technology trends, the level of maturity of that technology, and the trends will carry on into the future, clearly. But the level of maturity of the technologies has reached a point that it's enabled a fundamentally different business model, this cloud business model. The providers of these cloud applications and services have fundamentally different economics, and their mere existence in the marketplace has fundamentally changed the conversation between business and IT. For years, I don't know about you guys, but every customer I talk to, and I have the pleasure of talking to maybe 4 or 5 CIOs a week who come to our briefing center, and many more when I'm on the road. And I relate a story about how I used to go in. I went into a data center at one of my previous companies, and it's true of almost every company I've ever seen. You walk into the data center, and over in the corner somewhere, there's a couple of racks of machines. Sometimes in one place, there were several hundred of these machines. The lights were blinking. The disks were whirring and going the way disks do. And no one could tell me what the hell was running on any of them. Whoever had installed them had left, they'd gone to another company. Perhaps they'd retired. Perhaps they'd retired, had a great retirement and died. It's so long ago since anyone actually touched the assets in the other side of the data center. And that is so typical, and that is what has resulted in the last 30 years of essentially a status quo between the business and IT, where IT has had to say that there's, if you yank that cord, you don't know what's going to break. It's really difficult understanding the interdependencies of everything in the data center. And so we've had a culture that sits there and says, no, change is risk. Recently at one place, I was still quoted 9 months to get a terabyte of storage. 9 months is a decent gestational period for a human being, but really, I can go online and get myself, with my credit card, I get a terabyte in under 30 seconds. This is nuts. And this is what's happened. Fundamentally, the expectation that your business partners have of us, all of us, including me, is that they've seen that outside they can get these services that are self-service, instantly provisioned, pay for what you use, scale up, scale down, and cost efficient. And if they can get them outside, why the hell can't they have them inside? Now, of course, they still want the same old SLAs, the same security, indemnification, and everything else goes with it. And that is your challenge. But fundamentally, there's been a reset. The status quo, that has been there for the whole of my career in IT has been essentially swept aside. And it's because it's a change in expectation, not just in technology, a fundamental shift in expectation. And this is what drives what we think of, when we think of private clouds, we can talk all about the technology and what it delivers, but at the end of the day, it's this consumption experience that our partners and our customers want. That is what it's about. And technology makes it real. But they want this experience so that organizations can focus on their core differentiating value, and so they can innovate really, really quickly, deliver new value to market fast, beat their competitors, whatever it is. The question is, so what happens with the role of IT? Does IT suddenly disappear? In some sense, the IT organization, you could reasonably argue for SMBs and smaller businesses, doesn't quite disappear, but it slowly dissipates and drifts, right? Because what are you doing? You're federating a bunch of services in the cloud. You don't own any physical assets. It's a different thing. But for large enterprises, I personally believe it throws our role as leaders into ever sharper relief. That for the last 30 years, CIOs have slowly become the chief infrastructure officer. The owners of the assets that when they work, no one really cares, they're just happy, but they don't come and congratulate you. And when something goes wrong, you're the guy who gets pointed at. But the role of IT is truly, and the role of the CIO, is to map the business onto technology to deliver the services that the business needs at the right quality of service, at the right price, with the right level of flexibility, and to do so in a secure and compliant fashion. That is the role of the CIO. And the opportunity here now is that you have a new set of tools at your disposal in terms of how you deliver that you can do it externally, and you have new cost models that you can benefit from, as well as greater agility. And in fact, perhaps what we will see is a movement where instead of, as technologists, we've always found comfort in looking down at the detail of the technology that we end up managing and consuming, and a refocus up towards our partners in business and how we move from not just supporting what they do today and optimizing it, but enabling fundamentally new and different business models and enabling new opportunities for the business. That is the true opportunity here, we feel. So, talked a bit about the evolution. The other revolution that's happening is actually inside the data center. It's a little bit more detail, I guess, but I'll go through it quickly, because I think there's also messages here that are of value. So I don't know about your organizations. Many of the ones I've worked in are heavily siloed, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of people. There are people who manage servers, storage, networking, operating systems, databases, applications. Sometimes they're actually owned by your business partners, not by you. And then there's the security guys whose job remains, say no to the hand. And that changes risk. What we have seen is that the adoption of virtualization in the data center is actually beginning to change the way we think about managing infrastructure. That when you manage a virtual server, you're managing virtual storage, networking, compute together in the same environment. So again, I don't know about your organizations. I've been in places where I used to have to worry about doing root cause analysis, post-mortem analysis on outages for a very, very large business. And it would be kind of entertaining, because when something went wrong, you would get the storage and the networking and the compute guys together, they'd sit around a table, and you discovered that each group had a different name for the same physical asset. And they couldn't communicate with each other unless you had a translation table in front of you, because they came up with some cool, snazzy naming convention. The storage guys named everything after brands of beer, perhaps. Maybe the server guys, rugby teams or something. I don't know. They'd come up with something interesting. But the point was they couldn't execute change across their environment. It's like they couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. It was a disaster area. But the adoption of some of these technologies and the automation that goes behind it is fundamentally changing things, that we find we're seeing virtual admins and things like that. And so what this is leading to is really an opportunity with these technologies to reevaluate the way people do things. And by the way, I forgot to draw the line between virtualization and cloud, which I'll do very, very quickly. A certain company based to the north of us would sit there and say that virtualization alone does not a cloud make, which is incredibly poetic and trips off the tongue beautifully. To which I'd retort, no virtualization, no clouds. It is basically, without virtual machines, you would have no infrastructure as a service. You can do software as a service without them, but it's incredibly hard to partition and isolate users within application instances. It's actually really difficult. So virtualization inside and outside of the enterprise is driving this cloud thing to some greater degree. But what we see with the adoption inside the data center, inside enterprises, is an unrivaled opportunity to go back and look at the way you do things. So imagine the old days when you would roll out a new project, an application or a service. You would have the idea, you would start doing capacity planning on the amount of stuff you would need to be able to experiment and develop and everything else, and then you would raise some purchase orders, you'd get some capacity, you'd get going, you'd write the app, then you'd figure out, I have an app, let's do some capacity planning and figure out what production should look like, and 9 months later, it invariably ends up being 9 months. You might end up with something. So what we've seen is customers who go through this, and actually they run their infrastructure more like a traditional mainframe, where you run 15% excess capacity at all times. When an idea comes out and you need some capacity, you carve it out of your excess pool, you give it to them instantly, away they can go, or they give it to themselves instantly, more to the point, in the self-service kind of way. They get going. When your spare pool falls below a certain threshold, you replenish it. Or if you understand your capacity requirements really well in very seasonal environments, you could just choose to replenish every quarter, minimizing the number of times people actually go into a data center. Because every time someone goes in a data center, oh yeah, they have a habit of screwing up, breaking things, doing things wrong, and you want to minimize all of that. And so the opportunity here, when you think about adoption of some of these technologies, is to think about the processes that you have, not just the processes where you manage IT, but the processes in terms of your asset life cycle, your purchasing life cycle, and how you do things there. Those are the opportunities you have to really change, move the needle. You bought into the technology, but now you can actually allow it to fundamentally shift things and allow the business to innovate and do things much, much quicker. I would also say, this is a pointer for me, when I think about things like ITIL. I said change is risk and everything else. I had the pleasure of working for Her Majesty's government, specifically the defense organization, way back in the 80s when ITIL was originally created. And it was created to make IT processes repeatable and to mitigate human failure. Well, in this world now, we're automating the heck out of all of these things, so they're repeatable by definition. And actually, the human beings don't do stuff. So actually, there's an enormous opportunity to completely rethink the processes in terms of how you deliver IT to your business partners. So all of these things net together are actually kind of like a perfect storm. This is your challenge as IT leaders. There's all this stuff going on outside, a set of technologies, many of which that you have actually already adopted internally. All of these things have come along, and there's reached this inflection point where this new business model is enabled that has reset the expectations of your business partners. But you actually have a lot of the technology that facilitates this already. It's about how you choose to accept it and about the processes you wrap around it and the ways you think about it. It's an exciting time. I actually think in the whole of my career, this is actually the most exciting time I've had. Because when you have expectation changes, that is such a wonderful opportunity for change. So I'll bring in just a couple of other things, because Frank is correct in the sense of that cloud is not the be-all and end-all, but it's a kind of center around which many other things are going on. And there's definitely one of the other challenges for all of us as IT leaders is kind of around the consumerization of IT. There's two parts of it. First of all is the adoption of consumer devices and technology. So x86 in many ways is driven by consumer technology because the massive pervasive adoption of x86 in terms of devices, desktops, and everything else, that sheer volume drove down the cost of MIPS, essentially, to the point that it became a compelling platform in the data center where you could save vast sums of money. But with smartphones and tablets, things fundamentally shift. I would strongly encourage everyone in this room to not just look at things like tablets as being a more mobile and interesting new form factor for consumption of existing applications and services, just like there used to be on the desktop. I'll give you an example from my personal life. I have a ponytail. That's sort of indicative of maybe I like music, maybe not. Yes, I hang out with musicians. I'm actually a drummer. I'm not really a musician. They constantly remind me I just hang out with them. But I record my band's music. You can buy it on Amazon and YouTube, on iTunes and everywhere else. And we've had this great democratization that's gone on for 20 years. 10 years ago, it would cost me millions of dollars of technology and millions of dollars of studio time to create my music. And so I have lots of tracks of guitar, because we're kind of prog rocky, and my guitarist likes 40 tracks of guitar. You can never have enough guitar. It's like the sketch from Saturday Night Live where they say, more cowbell. Well, for him, it's more guitar, more guitar. But I can mix all of it on my virtual mixing desk on my desktop, but it takes a long time. I could spend $3,000, and I can buy a digital mixer that I can integrate with it. It increases my productivity by an order of magnitude, and it's great. Alternatively, I can buy a $10 app on my iPad and turn it instantly into an 8-channel digital mixer. It's much more immersive, it's much more productive. This is fundamentally different. It is not business and desktops as usual, right? This is an enormous opportunity for change. The other thing that is different is the expectation of the millennials coming into the workforce. It's fundamentally different. If I think about cloud is about instant gratification. This is consumer behavior that is not enterprise IT behavior. I get the service I want when I want it, I pay for what I use, and notionally, I throw it away when I'm done. That is a different kind of IT and a different kind of expectation in the enterprise. We get the bring my own device. It's not just that there's a different way of working with a tablet that is an opportunity. It's, for example, personally, I've been using Macs since 1984. I used to program on leases to put software on the damn things before they actually had enough disk space to do anything vaguely useful on them. But I know I'm more productive on a Mac than I am a PC. It's irrespective of whether one is better than the other. I am just more conversant with it. Doesn't it behoove my employer to maximize my productivity? I'm not exactly a cheap employee. The answer is yes. And so this is also driving the BYOD thing. Plus the fact that, like my daughters, they have a new smartphone every year. They get one free with their contract. They change their devices faster than you can ever change them, and they have better devices at home than you provide them at work. That's certainly the case for me, and we see that with ever more of our customers and partners out there. And then there's the whole social thing. You know, my 4 daughters, the 2-year-old who literally does go like that for every single device she sees, and my 19-year-old. That is the workforce of the future. They don't even look at email. I send them to her. I get an acknowledgement that it reached her mailbox. I don't think she's ever read them. And then when she wants me, it's like, Dad, she won't speak to me on the phone either. It's all got to be instant messaging. And just as a trivial aside, last week, I believe, there's a society in England for the Queen's speech kind of thing, the Queen's English. They couldn't form a committee to sustain them because in the face of texting and the various other ways of communicating, they've had to give up. No one's interested in sort of preserving the Queen's English. It's fundamentally shifting. The challenge for all of you and the challenge for us as a company is to enable you to safely and securely take advantage of all of this. The commute story is kind of interesting because the commute story really isn't about the kind of lofty arrogance and hubris of a king being shown for what it is in the face of nature. He was actually demonstrating to his subordinates that the king is not almighty in the face of nature and inevitability. That actually, there are some tides which a man cannot turn back. It doesn't matter what you do. And this is one of those. I use the example quite often. It's like the Matrix, where the agent has Neo with his head on the tracks with the subway train coming down the line. He says, "That, Mr. Anderson, is the sound of inevitability," as it clatters along the train to him, along the track. That is what is happening. We can't stand in the way of it. The question is, how do we take advantage of it? As a company, we think in terms of 3 layers, I'm not going to do you a sell on the products, but it's a useful way of breaking things down in terms of attacking things. Firstly, there's the infrastructure. I think in the long term, it's a cloud inside your business and outside your business. It makes no difference. I strongly argue that if you have adopted virtualization in your data center, you are already building a cloud. I don't care what you call it, you have, because you've put your applications into this thing called a virtual machine, and once they're in this thing called a virtual machine, you can not only squish lots of them onto less hardware to save you money, you can instantly provision them and switch them on. Aha, that's instant provisioning of cloud. You can wrap them around with the processes, and indeed, we and others will sell you tools that allow you to self-serve the provisioning of those applications and services. So turning yourself into a private cloud becomes your choice as to how fast you go there. Most of you have already made the really difficult decision to put your apps inside a VM, because understanding the apps is the hardest thing. Once you understand them and their dependencies and you've put them in the virtual machine, you suddenly have all of these opportunities in front of you that you can take advantage of. And it's your choice as to just how fast you walk or run off to this cloud thing. The infrastructure is itself different. One of the things you have to start thinking about is, yes, apps in a VM, we can do this cloud thing, but most of those apps were not designed to be super scalable, to change very quickly, or to be very easy to integrate. So you kind of have to think about, so what do I do about the apps? How do I build these cloudy attributes to apps to make them scale? Because the models are fundamentally different. When I was at the e-commerce company, in the old world, we used to think of an active-passive cluster for availability, and there'd be a recovery time when one dies and the other one starts up. In the cloud world, you have 100 instances of databases, and the data sort of striped all the way across it. You lose one, you lose 1/100th of your capacity, and depending on your availability model for that 1/100th of your capacity, you may lose 100th of your data for a short period of time. That's a different way of thinking and building applications and services, right? And some of our customers, for the services that differentiate them, you'll want to think about, how do I build those in a way that scales up, scales down, and is easy to integrate in this new world? And the desktop is kind of like the mainframe. It's going to hum in a corner for a long time, but 30 years ago, it became the place where we both ran applications and consumed them. It is going to be neither in 5 years' time for the vast majority of the applications and services that we care about. Our challenge, your challenge, is to allow your people to access the apps, the services, the data, perhaps desktop as a service, anytime, any place on the device of their choice, safely and securely. And it's not about managing the devices, it's about managing the people and maximizing their productivity and effectiveness for the business. And so that has to fundamentally change too. Those are the 3 layers that we think about. And if I leave you with one VMware thing before I go, it's that we're attacking all of those things. I came to VMware because virtualization is a foundation for all of this, not an end in itself. And in the same way for you, all of you who have invested in this technology, not necessarily ours, but who've invested in virtualization, you're already taking this journey. And our job as a vendor is to walk there with you. Quickly whizzing through some of the challenges, just to give you some real numbers on some of the pain here. With virtualization, we're seeing that the number of VMs, we're already at about 30-something million VMs. There's some really nice trivial stats along the lines of, there's a new VM born more frequently than there's a baby born in the United States of America these days. And by 2014, we'll have in excess of 80 million VMs out there. But the number of physical machines is unlikely to increase at anywhere near that rate. So automation, we talked about automation, is becoming the thing that we have to do. I actually don't think that's called automation. I think that's called assembly line. But what it is creating a set of processes that are genuinely optimized, that someone can build an engine and a chassis separately in parallel, and you can bring them together. And between 1905 and 1912, Henry Ford developed the assembly line and was extraordinarily successful. So much so that by 1930, more than 350 automobile manufacturers in the United States had gone out of business. Of course, many of those were basically bolting engines onto carriages and branding them. But if you didn't do the assembly line, you didn't exist. And now we have the machines building machines. Your data center is not something that can be run by people. If you're going to be agile, you're going to be moving fast, you need software, you need the machines to do it for you. That's the world we're moving to. And it can't be script-based. I've been in places where we automated everything with scripts. It works really well until you want to change the thing that you manage. And then you have to go back and rewrite all of your scripts from scratch. So you kind of want to invest in frameworks and things like that. You have to think differently. And that is the world that we're going to. In fact, the world we're going to, the software layer that we talk about is going to become a sort of cloud operating system. It'll map your business onto cloud infrastructure to deliver the right quality of service at the right price, right flexibility, without you really knowing anything about the physical hardware it runs on. You can't. I mean, 30 years ago, we had tape operators who would put spools of tapes on machines. You used to care what CPU was running your thread, and you might have cared about which memory bank was running it. These days, you don't even ask the question. The OS does it all for you, and you don't even check, right? You just trust it. It goes away, it does it. The same will be true in a number of years' time in terms of the physical infrastructure. You will care about the geographic location of those things. In fact, more about where the data is than anything else, because the data becomes your thing in the cloud that defines, where you want to put stuff. Data kind of has mass. It's difficult and expensive to move around. You don't want duplicates because managing data provenance is non-trivial. So anyway, the other thing that's happening, the applications are shifting, I talked about before, with things like the iPad, fundamentally different. One of the signals that's very interesting, I saw the comment about HTML5 out there. 2011 was the first year, the crossover point, where the majority of all new applications are OS neutral. And in fact, typically browser neutral as well. We're moving to the space where this really tells us that, when we think of the desktop, it's transmuting, it's going away. It is not the focus for delivery of new apps and services. The application landscape is transforming. Let me whiz through quickly. There's new frameworks, new ways of building value. If you think about how you integrate in this world, it is fundamentally different. You're using message busing, you're using data caching technologies and so forth to build new applications that have these scaling and resilient attributes that really, really matter. There are new application types. Data is perhaps the most fundamentally interesting thing. If we say, and you accept the assertion, that the fundamental opportunity of cloud is to focus on the core differentiating value of your business and to seek to commoditize the IT that does not differentiate you, then the question is, how do you understand your differentiation? Well, typically, it's data. It's data that reflects the interactions with your customers, your sensors, your marketplace, that's aggregated through your interactions with your customers. It's all about customer intimacy, intimacy with your marketplace, intimacy with your devices, if you're managing railroad track, whatever. As you capture all of that data, you now have an enormous opportunity to ask new classes of questions of semi-structured and unstructured data. So, for example, in e-commerce sites, it reached a point where a certain one was so large that it did more transactions per day than NASDAQ and NYSE combined, by some measure. Their lies, damn lies, and statistics. That was kind of one of those. But the analytics infrastructures are typically 3, 4, 5 times as big. When you listen to Facebook later on, 500 million people, every single interaction with those 500 million people is customized in real time. That's customer intimacy. It's not about running jobs 5 times a day or 6 times a day and getting intimacy that way. It's not traditional data warehouses. It's done on the fly in real time. And you are differentiated by that customer intimacy and the experience that you provide. That data also allows you to do long-term trending and analytics. If you think when you swipe a credit card, you get 30 seconds to run as many algorithms as humanly possible in that time in order to minimize the risk of fraud. So data is becoming fundamental to everyone's businesses. At the heart, it is the source of your differentiation. 15 years ago, auto manufacturers would run a simulation to save themselves having to crash a car, and they spent most of the time figuring out whether the simulation was realistic. 5 years ago, they would run the simulations without crashing the car. Now, they run as many simulations as they can to optimize the design for safety. It's all about data. This data also has a fundamentally different impact on physical infrastructure that you run it on. Because guess what? The boxes that run tools like Hadoop do really interesting analytics. They're connected in a different network architecture, and they tend to have 20 spindles per box, as opposed to attaching to a network array or whatever, right? So the physical infrastructure that supports this stuff quite often looks different. So these are new and interesting times. So let me whiz through, because I've technically run out of time. I've talked about the post-Windows experience. And it's really about a focus that moves away from the devices and where applications are run to really about managing the end user, the data, and the apps that they consume through policy, and then allowing them to connect via the devices of their choice that enable them to be as productive as we can make them for their jobs. So finally, I'll leave you with 3 slides that really talk about how things we see things fundamentally changing in terms of how IT is consumed. Particularly if we think about the principal use cases that old IT that we've all been brought up with has really been about. One has really been about labor automation, really automating the processes that we had today, removing cost and speeding them up and making them essentially more reliable. About worker productivity, and about non-human scale computing to some degree, complex analytics, things like that, doing things that people just can't. The new stuff is beginning to shift. It's really about thinking about how can I enable new types of business. It's not just about supporting the old way we used to do things. As a CIO becomes a new partner to the business, it's not a case of sitting there, I can save you cost, I can automate X. It's, if we use this technology, we could actually transform the business. Even businesses and customers that I see where they're dominated by physical assets, think shipping lines, there are still disruptive new business models that are coming out of the woodwork that are threatening their businesses. It's all about transformation. It's the individual worker, it's about maximizing their productivity and getting innovation, allowing a new class of collaboration. If you think about the enterprise and where it's going to go, if it's dominated by these millennials who are social, isn't a social platform going to be the way they do workflow instead of a ticketing system? You know, we've built infrastructures and entire processes dedicated to maximizing the efficiency with which we open, process, and close tickets. Tickets mean nothing. They're an artifact of solving a problem that someone cares about, an artifact of how you allow people to collaborate. Shouldn't you have a tooling framework that facilitates collaboration? And then finally, data has become this enormous thing. The one caution I would use with big data, and I have been lucky enough to interact with it on a number of occasions, is you've got this wonderful toolkit, but I've never found that staring at the data provides interesting innovation. You have to ask an intelligent question. So as with all of this stuff and all the whole cloud conversation, it's a great set of tools, but ultimately you and your partners in the business have to figure out the problems you want to solve and the opportunities you want to take advantage of to provide a direction for using this technology. Without those, it's kind of, well, if I buy myself cloud, I buy myself success. No, right? It has to be really well applied. So if we think about where the IT organization ends up in this world, as an organizational purpose, it moves from being the sole provider of IT to the curator of external services. As I said, at VMware, we use 25 software as a service applications. So our CIO manages those. We have technology that allows us to have single sign-on across all of them. So we sign in once, it's integrated with Active Directory when our guys leave. All their IDs and passwords are removed from every one of the things. In fact, they never know their ID and password for each of the SaaS apps. So we curate those applications that do not differentiate us, and we source them as a commodity from somewhere else. That it's more around subscription and turning everything into an OpEx. Now that's clearly challenging when entire businesses have been geared around extremely large CapEx budgets. Say one place I ran, we had a $300 million a year CapEx budget for the IT. Every data center was another $300 million. It starts becoming really, really big. But everything was geared around CapEx management and asset life cycles as opposed to turning it into an operating expense and allowing us to do a more pay-for-use kind of way of doing things. Security is no longer walls and moat because you don't have everything inside your data center. So the question is, how do you secure the virtual enterprise? It's really about the user and the services, not the physical infrastructure anymore. That is a significant challenge. For the applications, instead of being an integrator of in-house apps that you buy, you're going to be integrating SaaS applications. These are significant challenges. I'm not going to tell you that we've got them all solved as an industry, because plainly we haven't. But we know and understand what they are, and we will address them. But if you look at SaaS, single sign-on is great, but what about the fact that every SaaS provider has a slice of your corporate data? How do you make sure each of those slices is safe and secure and compliant and in sync with your business? I laugh because, in fact, most of the SaaS application's data is not my business's data. It's my personal data. It's my payroll, my healthcare, my holiday, and everything else that goes with it. But actually, we do run our business on SaaS. We use CRM, and we're pushing other stuff that way too. It's about policies. Instead of being an enforcer of corporate policies and uniformity, it's about being the custodian of corporate information. And that information ultimately is what differentiates businesses. It's not the infrastructure. It's the data and the services that you use and build to take advantage of that data. And data is enormously exciting. You know, if you think about data, I would strongly argue that, you know, now you have applications that are mobile, you should be moving the apps to the data, not the other way around. It's very hard to move data around. It has mass. Someone coined the term data gravity, I guess. It's very difficult to move the stuff around. You don't want to duplicate it, because then you have to keep track of all the duplicates, figure out which is authoritative, and so forth. And we don't have the bandwidth in the ground, or anywhere else for that matter, to move all the world's data. There's too much of it. And finally, you know, line of business versus central IT. In the past, IT managed the projects, but really what you want IT to do is to enable the BUs to actually take control of the services that differentiate them themselves, and to hide the complexity of all the physical infrastructure and everything else from them. And all of this, I would strongly assert, is actually about helping our customers and our partners and you, CIOs, to move you from what you have become in many, many cases, the chief infrastructure officer, to the chief information officer, to the person who is the custodian of the data that, when you turn it into actionable information, differentiates and powers your businesses.